My pleasant task to introduce the distinguished panel at the head table today. From your left to your right is Mr. Manuel Lafont Rapnouil, Head Policy Planning, Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, France. Mr. Kenneth Juster, Distinguished Fellow, Council on Foreign Relations, United States, and former Ambassador of the United States to India. Mr. Heribert, Senior Fellow, German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Germany. And Ms. Alena Kudzko, Vice President, GLOBSEC, Slovakia. Welcome to this conversation over cover titled The Sanction Question, Currency of Mass Destruction. And the session is moderated by Ambassador Navdeep Suri, Distinguished Fellow of the Observer Research Foundation. Over to you, Ambassador Suri.
Thank you very much. As you can see, I jumped the gun a little early. The topic that we have for this evening is relevant. The sanctions that have been imposed post the Russian invasion of Ukraine are a bit like a blind man feeling an elephant and trying to figure out which side is he witnessing and trying to make out. The impact of the sanctions has clearly unleashed the law of unintended consequences, where the country that has been targeted may do badly, but as of now, the ruble has rebounded, and the war is entering the third month. Meanwhile, countries across the world, and certainly here in India, are feeling the pinch of the sanctions, even though we are continuing to buy some limited quantities of Russian oil. But the fact is that every dollar increase in the price of oil adds a few $1 billion to our import bill. And the pressure that comes on the fisc reduces the space that was needed to reboot the economy after the pandemic shock. At the same time, the inflationary pressures that have been unleashed in India and around the world because of the rise in oil prices reduces the flexibility that the central bank needs in terms of its own monetary policy initiatives with the interest rates. And so there's a kind of a cascading impact that you see from sanctions. We have an old saying in India. In Hindi, it says, "Saamp bhi mare aur lathi bhi na toote," which broadly translates into, I want to kill the snake, but I don't want to break my stick trying to kill the snake. Here, I fear that we may be breaking the stick and not killing the snake either. So I wanted to put this out to our distinguished panelists, that these sanctions that have been imposed, do you think that they are achieving the desired outcomes? And do you think that there's a way to control the unintended consequences so that the collateral damage being caused by the sanctions on those that are not the intended target can be somehow limited? Ambassador Juster, why don't I start with you, Ken?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. There are a lot of questions you have in that first comment. Yeah, sanctions are not a single concept. It is a spectrum of activities, and sanctions can be very effective when they're targeted at a narrow situation, whether it's individuals or on a topic such as counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, non-proliferation. Obviously, when you have it more broadly based and countrywide, it's a more unwieldy instrument with, as you said, collateral damage. We have here, though, an extraordinary circumstance. When you have the potential for a conflict such as we're seeing now in Russia and Ukraine, countries have a decision. On one end of the spectrum is do nothing and watch the devastation that's occurring. On the other end of the spectrum is get involved militarily and have a full-fledged military conflict. And policymakers often choose something in between, which is some form of economic sanction. And what's happened here is because the invasion is such an extraordinary circumstance, it's unprovoked, it's in violation of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which guaranteed or assured Ukraine of its sovereignty and territorial integrity and its freedom of. It's coming now with the UN General Assembly having said that this was an improper action by the Russians. You've put in place these sanctions that do have severe collateral consequences. But my concern, quite frankly, is as bad as these consequences are, if 30 to 60 days from now we see utter devastation of Ukraine and a killing of innocent people, we may actually ask ourselves, did we do enough? What could we have done to stop this? Should the sanctions have even been more severe? And that's going to be the trade-off, and that's the challenge, is if you don't want to get involved militarily, but you do want to try to stop the situation, what is the policy instrument? As I said, this is an extraordinary circumstance. There is no doubt that when you have sanctions that are this widespread, they have a lot of unintended consequences, and it imposes a lot of pain on people. But the problem, in my opinion, is not the sanctions, it's the invasion of Ukraine that led to the sanctions. There were no sanctions in place until after the invasion took place, and then the question is, what's the response to the world? So it's not an easy issue, and it's one that we're going to look back on and wonder, did we do enough if Ukraine is devastated? As you said, it hasn't. The sanctions haven't succeeded thus far. Should we be doing more? Should we be getting involved militarily, which then risks a nuclear war? So there are not a lot of good options, but this is what policymakers are struggling with.
Which is a fair point, but over the decades, I think we've been speaking about smart sanctions to avoid this kind of collateral damage. I was looking at this chart about countries in Africa and what percentage of their wheat imports were coming from Russia or Ukraine. Egypt, 90%. Somalia, South Sudan, 90%, 95%. And these countries are now scrambling for alternate sources of something as basic as wheat at prices that they probably will not be able to afford. So the collateral damage is real. Manuel, does France have a point of view on this? Could it have been done differently, or can it still be done differently?
I think it's important to remember that the existing sanctions don't target food trade. So the food impact...
The law of unintended consequences, right?
The food impact is not targeted. The war has an impact on the food trade of both Ukrainian food trade and Ukraine's ability to actually deliver and export, because countries at war, the harbors are attacked. Some of the civilian ships that tried to go through the Black Sea at first have now decided that it's not safe enough to do that. And Russia is having its own reason to do differently. That's one of the first things. Another good example of the fact that precisely sanctions have been designed to be targeted is SWIFT. In the pitch for the debate in the small booklet that you'll have, it calls about de-SWIFTing as a kind of carpet measure. But de-SWIFTing of banks has been very targeted, precisely to avoid the kind of broad impact that total de-SWIFTing of Russia banking system would have had. And that's another explanation, another illustration of the fact that these sanctions are targeted. The way the EU, I speak for the EU, has been doing sanctions so far in that particular case is not to inflict as much pain and go for this rhetoric of maximal pressure against Russia. The idea, I don't think, at least in France, the idea was not to deter Russia to move ahead. If you remember, before February 24th, there was a lot of discussion, including from the US authorities, saying this will happen anyway. the idea was always from the start that these sanctions would help to have an impact on Putin's war machine. And Putin's war machine is at the same time its ability to spend for military equipment and pay for the military effort and provide for his military with procurement of technology, for instance, and also to target the political support, and in particular, let's call it the oligarch-based economy that is being taxed to pay for the war machine. And so obviously that's a long endeavor. It's not going to succeed in a few weeks, but if you look at the current economic situation for Russia, it does have an impact, and it probably is a problem for the way Russia can live with the consequences of its acts, both from a domestic perspective, from a long-term perspective in terms of diversification of its economy. And there are a lot of measures that have to do not with sanctions, but just with businesses, private companies being present in Russia for a while and deciding that it's not necessarily a good idea for their business to stay in a country that invades its neighbor. And that is nothing to do with sanctions, but it does have an impact on the Russian economy. So I'm not saying there is no impact of sanctions on third countries. In the case of the EU, our sanctions regime don't have an extraterritorial reach. So our design is not to have that kind of impact on third countries. There is friction on trade. There are market anticipation. You have the kind of business decisions that I made. And that happens in a very adversarial context, economically speaking. But there was an earlier panel today on the arbitration between trade and security, which was more focusing about the relation with China. And I felt that the idea was that in this arbitration between trade and security, there was a fear that Europeans would choose trade and the economy. And it's now funny to be in a discussion where I feel the atmosphere is more that, on the contrary, Europeans have chosen security against trade and economy. Clearly, it's an arbitration between trade and security. And I think this arbitration is not just for European security.
Alena? Any thoughts from Slovakia?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I'll pretty much also echo what the previous speakers have said. Of course, if we're talking about whether the sanctions are delivering on the goal, we first should ask what was the original goal. And these rather draconian by all standards sanctions are intended to inflict damage on Putin's capacity to wage this full-scale war and potentially to do even more damage if this ambition is not checked right now. So from that perspective, the sanctions, of course, have not delivered the final peace and negotiated outcome, but they do limit significantly already now the resources on which Putin can count in terms of being able to stay in Ukraine and potentially going even further than that. But of course, sanctions do not work in isolations, and there are a lot of measures that have been taken to make sure that we're achieving some kind of a peaceful settlement in Ukraine, and of course, ideally, we would have averted the war. The West has actually criticized that it was too soft on Russia for a long time, and a lot of criticism is not about the fact that sanctions are there right now, but about the fact why things have not been taken care of much earlier, why we even ended up in the situation where we are right now. When we are talking about the sanctions and whether they're achieving the outcome, the good question would be also against what outcome we're comparing it. Can sanctions deliver an ideal outcome where everybody is well behaved and there is a peaceful ideal system, nobody's attacking it? No, that would be naive to expect that. But what we're comparing it against is against the cost of doing nothing. And the cost of doing nothing is potentially much higher than the cost of sanctions, including the collateral damage. The cost of doing nothing would include also the actually damage to the international system, to the global order. That would imply that countries can at will attack the neighbors or whoever they want, and in any way there would be no rules that exist in the international system. And I doubt that actually African countries were mentioned. I don't think that African countries would benefit significantly from this dissolution of the global order if there is no system of the checks and balances on aggression that can be introduced right now.
Thank you. Heribert?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's late in the day and you expect some controversial discussion. I can assure you that there is one consensus that we have on the panel, and that is that this is a complicated issue. But beyond that, I think I will differ from the previous speakers. I don't think that the sanctions are well targeted, a good idea, and I don't see that they contribute to the solution of the conflict. Let me first of all ask the question, what is going to be achieved and what is supposed to be achieved with the sanctions? Initially, at least the rhetoric was that the sanctions shall bring down the Russian economy and they shall force President Putin to stop his operations. You can only come up with such an assessment if you don't look briefly into the history of Russia and into the preferences of Russian society. Even at a first glimpse, you realize that the sanctions imposed after 2014, the annexation of Crimea, have not resulted in a weakening of support for President Putin, but have rather increased the support for President Putin. 71% of the Russian population has been rallying around, well, it's not the flag, it's around Putin. What I would also like to add is, and I can quote numerous American observers, starting with the late George Kenneth, who in one of his last interviews in the New York Times in the 1990s was basically predicting what we have today, an irrational activity by the Russian government against the perception. I'm not commenting on the perception, but it is there, that the West is coming closer. And what we also have to consider is that there are non-economic issues that enjoy a preference in Russian society. Now, speaking as a German, it's of course, I have to confess that since my country invaded Russia twice in the 20th century, I can understand that there's a certain nervousness towards the West. It's not an excuse for the invasion, don't get me wrong, but that there is a certain nervousness in Russian society, I can understand. And if you agree that there are non-economic issues that are above the economic sphere, then those economic sanctions will not deliver. In the last weeks, I have not become a sanction expert, but I've read quite a bit about sanctions and the history of sanctions. And there's a book out by a Cornell scholar called Nicholas Mulder. It's very recommendable. It's published this year. And Mulder looks into the history of sanctions, and he had a piece in the New York Times this week where he said basically, forget the idea that sanctions will deliver the expected result. Just forget it. It has never worked in history. The US has been sanctioning Cuba for, I don't know, since I'm on the planet, hasn't worked. It has sanctioned Venezuela, hasn't changed anything. Now, by the way, the sanctions against Venezuela are lifted. The history of sanctions is a history of failures, and I think we should also acknowledge that Russian society 100 years ago was exposed to sanctions because they had the wrong political system, and that didn't work either. It didn't change the political system of the Soviet Union. Ivan Krastev, the Bulgarian thinker, said this week in a piece in the FT, if I'm not wrong, the response of the West is a bit of an odd response, as if the West wanted Russia to appear from the map. I think the term he used, it's Chernobylizing Russia, putting concrete on it, forget about it, make it disappear. And I don't think that will happen. Second last point, from a geopolitical perspective, what we are currently doing doesn't seem to be a good idea. And again, this is not an excuse for the brutal invasion of Ukraine, but the bigger conflict is with China. Now we are driving Russia into the arms of Xi Jinping. Again, a former American security advisor, Brzezinski, in the 1990s, wrote a book on that question. And he said, this is exactly what you should avoid, to drive Russia into the arms of the People's Republic of China. We are doing that. So by winning, and I doubt that we're winning it, but even if we were winning the current conflict with Russia, we would drive Russia into the arms of the Chinese and would make winning the geopolitical conflict, which is much more important because China indeed is a systemic competitor. Russia isn't. I'm of course tempted to quote John McCain, who said it's a gas station masquerading as a country, but that would be too much. It is not a systemic competitor to the West and to liberal democracy. It's a large country physically, but it's not a systemic threat. Final point on finance, and I think this is a very important point. We are implementing sanctions on Russia which are unprecedented. Now, the simple question to ask is, if nobody has done it before, were they smarter or are we smarter? If throughout the gold standard thing, where there were numerous wars and for 75 years there was no such a sanction ever employed in the gold standard, and we're doing that now. The question is, do we know what we're doing? Do we know what we're doing when we have a financial system that has only one major ingredient, and that is trust? We have a paper currency. We don't have a gold-backed currency. We have a paper currency, and we have a double attack on the trust in our financial system at the moment. One is inflation, and the other is the sanctions. Now, the inflation one I can't comment on, but the sanctions will result in an increased appetite for alternative systems, and these will be non-Western systems. Maybe India can tell us a little bit about the potential for alternative systems. Is that in our long-term interest? I doubt it very much. So to make a little bit of a provocation, we have, and I'm as a German, I'm puzzled by the atmosphere that I'm confronted with back home. Previous pacifists want to go to the front. The British journal The Economist has quipped that Germans are revising their position yet again. The title of that piece was From Plowshares to Swords. And so I'm a little bit puzzled by the eagerness of German and other European societies to have the toughest sanctions. One former German president said, "We shall freeze for freedom." It's a little bit surprising that we so easily want to have a significant economic crisis, and that crisis will hit us harder than Russia. It's not exactly the intention of sanctions, is it?
Thank you, Heribert. In fact, your question, your point about India reminded me that since Professor Shamika Ravi, who was supposed to be on the panel, is not with us, I guess I'll have to take on myself the responsibility to be both the moderator and the one giving the Indian Indian view on this. For us, we've consistently maintained in India that we will only follow UN-mandated sanctions, and sanctions that are imposed without that UN mandate put us in a very awkward position. We've had that experience with the US sanctions on Iran. We've had that previously with Venezuela, because we used to buy a lot of oil from Venezuela, and Iran, of course, we've had a long-standing relationship. So it does pose the question to countries like India that how do we insulate ourselves from mood swings inside the Beltway from the Oval Office or Capitol Hill, which can dramatically swing from one side to the other. And on the point that Heribert made, I think India would be amongst the countries seriously thinking that about a what-if scenario of SWIFT being targeted at a country like ours. Tomorrow, we do something in Jammu and Kashmir that you don't like, which we believe is in our national interest. Does that trigger a similar reaction? And if so, should we be thinking preemptively? Is China already thinking preemptively based on the lessons being learned from Russia's experience of how to act in that eventuality? So what lessons are being derived? And maybe I'm being provocative on this. So let me open up myself and others to Ken to take it forward.
Okay, there are a lot of points I want to unpack that have been mentioned. And let me just take them and in the spirit of debate on them. A lot of this depends on your perception of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. Is this just another sort of one-off conflict? Or is this a major change in the international system of an unprovoked attack on the entire country without following any of the rules of warfare or international law, that's seeking to devastate it, that is killing innocent civilians, targeting hospitals, is completely indiscriminate and is going to leave it as a wasteland? That is an unprecedented action. That is not, I hope India doesn't have to worry about sanctions for something like that. It's not going to happen. So I just think it's wrong to say sanctions are the problem. The problem is what's going on with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Secondly, I don't agree that we are pushing Russia toward China. Russia and China got together, Putin and Xi, in February and put out an unprecedented statement of their strategic partnership that knew no bounds. And China has chosen not to step in. It's a country that has leverage on both Russia and Ukraine through its trade relationship and be a global leader and try to mediate the dispute. However uncomfortable it might be with Russia's tactics, it's standing behind it and sees this as a way to damage and dent and destroy the current international order to rebuild one that is more to perhaps its liking and Russia's liking. So we haven't pushed them. They go on their own. It would be my second point. Third, I take the point on the finance system, as I said earlier. Look, sanctions that are targeted at individuals, at, as I said, narcotics, counterterrorism, can be very effective. And it would be great if you had broad multilateral support for sanctions as a theoretical matter. And I would be the first to say that I think sanctions are being overused. And that does have collateral consequences, including a concern about the dollar as the reserve currency. But the dollar is the reserve currency not because we may use or not use sanctions, because the United States has the most robust economy, with the strongest institutions, with an independent central bank, with convertible currency, liquid markets, a strong military. You go through all the indicia of stability. That's why people put their money in the dollar. The euro has not shown itself to be that durable. The Chinese currency is not even convertible. And it's ruled by the country by a sole individual that can make an arbitrary decision with no institutional backup. So they have a very little amount of the reserve currency. Now, it is true that countries that act like Russia might say, hey, we don't want to be under the dollar as a reserve currency, and they might form a separate system, but I would venture to say that I think most countries will stay with the dollar as the reserve currency until the United States truly does have a change in its stability and its power and its liquidity and things of that nature. Again, I don't disagree that there are some very bad collateral damages from the sanctions, and that this does erode trust in the financial system. Those are negatives. But the question is, what are the alternatives? And they're not good ones. I mean, we don't want to go in and use military weaponry and get a more severe potential war. And people don't want to sit and look at what's going on and say, business as usual, and flick it off. And so that's the moral dilemma that we're dealing with. But again, it was not precipitated by preemptive sanctions. It was precipitated by a conflict that took place that was unprovoked. And it's hard to say that they haven't worked yet. We'll have to see what's happening over time. Certainly, the Russian economy is devastated. Russia, I think any way one looks at the situation, is going to come out of this much weaker. It's going to be politically and economically isolated. Its economy will be in a shambles. And it's already shown that its military capabilities is far from what people thought it was going to be. So that's another issue. Certainly, if you could get UN-mandated sanctions, the problem is, in our lifetime, there's been a very small period, really after the Cold War, that the UN really functioned effectively. And the UN is very polarized, so you're just not going to get that. And we saw that we didn't get UN Security Council condemnation of what went on in a completely unanimous way, but by a majority there and by an overwhelming majority in the General Assembly, they have condemned what's taken place in terms of Russia. The Secretary General has spoken up very severely on it. So it's not a perfect system. And by the way, the last point I'd make is, I know that the United States likes to be the target of criticism, but this is not a unilateral U.S. action. There are 37 countries that are behind this. And by the way, most of those countries are the ones that are part of the basket of reserve currencies, so they're not going to be going to another one other than a very small parts. So this is not an easy issue. It's not neat. It's not pretty. But I go back to where I began, is that the problems are precipitated by Russia's unprecedented action, and it truly is unprecedented in I guess maybe Iraq took Kuwait off the face of the earth, and that was restored in the Gulf War. But that's what's provoked the situation, and that's what we're responding to. And it's not ideal and pretty, but it's versus what the alternatives might be.
So, if one were to draw from this three broad points, one, that sanctions seem to be seductive but not effective, particularly second, that this round of sanctions doesn't seem to enjoy the breadth of international support. If you look at UN voting behavior of countries that abstained or opposed. And the third, the broader geo-economic impact of not just these sanctions, but tools of economic coercion, broadly speaking, whether it's China using it against Australia or other countries being tempted to use it in different circumstances. So should we be looking at an international mechanism that at least puts in place some sort of rules of the game? If we speak of a rule-based international order, then shouldn't we have rules about when, who, and how can impose sanctions? And particularly, as Ken has mentioned, that the UN Security Council is too polarized or divided, or when one of the permanent members itself is taking that position. Manuel, you want to take that?
There are rules already. The WTO provides for the possibility to adopt sanctions for national security purposes. And that's part of most international trading regimes. And the recent international reality is that it's probably fair to discuss how much of the trade wars that we've seen, of the trade measures that we've seen, had to do with security interest, but likely not in this case. If I was to fight that argument, I would not fight it with the argument of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. I'm from a country who fought 2 world wars with Moscow. And the French president tried to negotiate with Putin until the very end. And he's been criticized by some of his fellow European leaders for that. So I I must say I don't agree with this idea that we've pushed Russia towards China or provoked any of these. And I agree that it's not just that the February 4th declaration between Russia and China was adopted 20 days before the aggression and even longer before sanctions, but I think China was not happy with what it saw on February 24th. I think India is not happy with what it saw, irrespective of what they say publicly. And in terms of breaking the trust, that's probably a bit deeper and a bit broader consequences than trust in the financial system. One of the key questions, because I want to challenge this really, is this idea that sanctions are ineffective. Sanctions are ineffective only if you think that sanctions have this kind of very generic approach that you need to inflict as much pain as possible and then something is going to happen by miracle. And some people see sanctions like that, but clearly in the EU, the idea is that sanctions are not punitive. If you want to make them effective, you need to be strategic, you need to look at the design. Sometimes it's about signaling, sometimes it's about coercing, sometimes it's about constraining. These are the three roles that you want. It's not about inflicting pain. It's not about attrition or regime change. It's about looking at how you're going to undermine the ability of the other to do what he's doing, and which is a problem because it's a blatant violation of a key tenet of the international order. There is no idea in the EU that because the EU has adopted sanctions, the rest of the world has to abide by EU sanctions. That's why we don't have this extraterritorial reach of sanctions. Of course, the more the merrier. We think that sanctions would be more effective, that the signal to Putin that he needs to stop what he's doing would be better if we were more numerous in adopting some kind of sanctions, and it doesn't have to be all the same kind of sanctions. But there is no idea that other countries have to be forced to abide by this. It's not the maximal pressure strategy that Trump had in a world where the idea is that if you have pain, you will have gain. The pain and the gain are different things. What is, I think, important is that sanctions, it's not a one-size-fits-all response. It's like saying sanctions work or don't work. It's like saying military force work or doesn't work, or trade works or doesn't work, etc. The key question is about the condition. Which are your goals? What are you looking for? Is it a lone-standing instrument, or is it part of a strategy? There is a strategy. There is an evolution of the military posture. There is actually pressure coming from the UN, and nobody thought that 141 members of the UN, which is a huge number, much bigger than what happened in 2008 with Georgia. But nobody expected these 141 countries to go for sanctions. One of the countries that France and EU fellow members are supporting the most now is Moldova. I don't think in the EU anyone expects Moldova to adopt the kind of sanctions that we've adopted. And yet we support Moldova, we want to strengthen our relations with Moldova, because we think that there is a risk for Moldova, not just for Ukraine, and for the stability of Europe, and for this partnership between China and Russia.
So, Heribert, you got enough on the plate?
Yeah, oh yeah, that's, I of course am aware of the fact that there are good reasons to be angry about, and to be frustrated, and to be belligerent about this invasion of Ukraine, and I'm not a specialist on the issue, but what I have worked on and seen in the last 8 years since the annexation of Crimea is that it's a bit more complicated than we currently portray it. And what I currently do not see is, first of all, I beg to differ that the sanctions are a strategy. A strategy would have more defined rules, and we would see what is at the end of the road. And what I don't see is a discussion on a solution, and we have to find a solution on that. And when I see that Germany is what is that, expeding diplomats when you send them away?
Expelling?
Thanks. When Germany is expelling 40 diplomats, Russia is expelling 40 German diplomats. At the end of the day, we have no communication channels, and that is not a good way forward. We would have to find a significant, huge conference for a setup that is satisfactory to all parties involved. I'm not saying that I have a plan, but this sliding ever deeper into conflict, this almost sleepwalking ever deeper into conflict, is a big concern. I'm asking myself, as a participant, but also as an observer, why the response, not in this country, for instance, but why the response in Western societies, in all European societies, I have no clear perception what's happening in the United States, but in all European societies, there is a great level of anger, and particularly the younger the people, the greater the anger. And this, in a way, was picked up by Phil Stevens in an article 8 years ago. And Phil Stevens, in that article after the invasion of Crimea, said the world is waking up from its postmodern dreams of global governance, and this is part of the story. We thought we have left that behind us. Never mind that there have always been wars in other parts of the world, but they weren't that close. So the Western societies, Western European societies, are waking up, and their anger has no valve. So apparently governments are willing to give an expression to that, apart from the fact that governments would probably impose sanctions on their own. But for the communication between citizens and governments, the sanctions work very well. And I think this is an important point to keep in mind. What we also have to see is that the front is already breaking up. The American Finance Minister Janet Yellen this week warned the Europeans not to put a boycott on oil from Russia, because the effects would be devastating elsewhere. And so that is already kind of a bit of an issue. I mean, in Germany, we have an intensive debate. Some, dare I say, rather lunatic economists are making model calculations of what would happen to the German economy if we switch off the gas imports from Russia. The head of the biggest chemical company in the world, BASF, has said it wouldn't stop the production of the products we make, they would just be produced elsewhere. These are some points I would like to make. The broader point that I would like to make is we are living in an environment that is characterized by an increased appetite for autarky. And sanctions and autarky are kind of reinforcing each other.
They love each other.
You look at the 1920s, you look at the First World War, we don't have time for the details, but this is an unfortunate process. And I'm a great believer in free trade. I'm a great believer also in the international division of labor, and we are not just because of the sanctions, but also because of the sanctions. We divide the world in friends and enemies. We do trade with our friends, but we don't do trade with our enemies. That's not a good recipe. The sanctions are just part of it.
So let me take a quick comment from Alena and then open up to the floor.
I think one thing where we probably all agree is that we do need a better system and better solution than sanctions. The problem is what we do until we find these better solutions. That might take decades. And I don't think that Ukrainians or pretty much other people can wait for decades until we find these better solutions. And I can tell you why there is a great level of anger. Because the country is being leveled to the ground, because people are literally being butchered. And honestly, I'm from Slovakia. The question that makes people angry is that they have to think whether they're going to be next. and whether they can do something about it. So I don't think there is a surprise that there is a lot of concern and anger, and that people cannot just sit idly and watch everything of that developing in front of their eyes. And concerning this postmodern world, of course, if we say that the system will be destroyed, that that there is no other way, of course, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if everybody says there is no other way, we will all be stuck in this constant destruction and conflict. A quick comment about the sanctions. Ambassador, I think you said that sanctions are seductive. I beg to differ. I don't think everybody in Europe was excited to introduce the sanctions. Quite the opposite. There was a huge aversion to sanctions. There were a lot of debates before they were introduced. Believe me, nobody enjoys the sanctions. No European is excited about the fact that we have to do it. But again, there were no better solution on the table. Once it's there, everybody will be happy to consider it. In terms of the Crimea, Cuba, Venezuela. Crimea, part of the reason why Putin enjoys support after the Crimea, because actually not that much been done in reaction to Putin's annexation to Crimea. The sanctions that were introduced were pretty laughable. They didn't do any damage. So of course, Putin was emboldened and could make a point that he succeeded and that he could go very far. But of course, we also need to take into consideration domestic situation in Russia, where Putin controls the media narrative entirely, and there's not much alternatives that were offered for the people. In the long run, though, if the sanctions continue with the speed they go, people in Russia are still not isolated. They can compare themselves to the world. And in the longer run, the fridge will win over the flag. That's typical human nature, and that will likely to happen in Russia as well. And the final point also about the fact that Europeans are becoming very belligerent, I wouldn't put it this way. Actually, there is maybe a much needed awakening, because Europeans are also often accused of living in this paradise, of this garden that is maintained by somebody, and there is awakening that actually this global order, this security, is maintained by somebody. And maybe it's a nasty surprise to our German friends, but German economy, European economy can only be successful because somebody maintains security and somebody makes sure that there is no conflict. So I don't think that we can just pretend that it will continue forever. And at some point, we are facing the necessity to make sure that we also take responsibility for maintaining it.
Great. So sanctions are necessary. Sanctions cause collateral damage, but maybe do we need mechanisms to help those who are at the receiving end of the collateral damage so that people sitting far away are impacted? But let me open up for questions. Yes, what I'll do is I'll take 3, and if there's a particular panelist that you want to direct it at, please say so. Ma'am.
Thank you very much. Sarah Bressan, working at GPPI, the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. I mainly work on conflict prevention, and I must say I'm worried. We have not just humanitarian crises, food insecurity crises in many regions that last time I checked were pretty relevant also to EU policy, also to US policy, with a commitment to conflict prevention with the Global Fragility Act and similar efforts in the EU. And the sanctions have effects on all of these places, and we know that rising commodity prices are a driving factor. What I want to ask is, what are concrete steps that those that are implementing the sanctions right now are taking to communicate that this is still a concern, and what can be done about it, and how to also, towards other countries who may not see this as so much as a global shift as opposed to other places that were farther away. You know, it's a matter of perspective, how to still be credible towards South Africans, Indians, and so on and so forth, who may not see that much of a qualitative difference in this conflict as opposed to others. And really, you know, worrying about the long-term impact of the effects these sanctions have on both conflict breaking out, but also the reputation of the countries deciding on them. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am, from there. No, over there. Yeah.
Sorry, I should introduce myself. My name is Sarah Teach. I'm an international human rights lawyer. I work a lot with victims of atrocity crimes. We've spoken a lot about, do sanctions have the desired outcomes? My question is, what exactly are those desired outcomes? If the theory underlying sanctions is deterrence, is it specific deterrence or general deterrence? Are we talking about Russia pulling out of Ukraine, or are we talking about giving China a pause before they invade Taiwan or other countries?
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Esther from Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and also Raisina Young Fellow. My question is, it seems that there are two camps here, which is first, you think that economic sanctions are not working, and then secondly, that we can't tell whether it's working yet or not. So is there a threshold of which you think at one point in time that, yes, these sanctions are not working, and then we should think of other alternatives, whether that's going back to the negotiating table with Putin or what other alternatives are there? And then my second question is to Mr. Manuel and Ambassador Kenneth. Recently we found out that Le Pen was defeated, but we know that there's a genuine potential of that she could win the election. And then I'm just wondering also, Ambassador Kenneth, had President Trump be the one leading U.S. right now, and Le Pen be the one leading France, whether your country's moves against Russia will be different? Thank you.
Okay, let me take one question from here and then turn it over to the panel. Yes, please.
Hello. My name is Calvin from Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia. So I'm coming a question in the observation from Southeast Asia people. Why sanctions comes very fast? It seems that sanctions is the first go-to response in responding to a crisis, because in Southeast Asia, when we come into a sanctioning, excluding Myanmar political representative in ASEAN summit, we came into a long process of well-calibrated, and we think into that point. Why it's so fast, and then why is that? So I just want to know the insight from that point. Thank you.
Great. We have 4 wonderful questions. Ambassador, you want to start?
Okay. I'll take a crack at a few of those points. First of all, you were saying, why aren't we doing things other than sanctions? Again, you have to realize what was going on. There was a full-blown diplomatic effort to try to negotiate with Russia and address its concerns well before the invasion, and that is still ongoing. There's been an effort to continue to have talks. Countries have tried to intervene and mediate. Turkey has, Israel has. So it's not as if it's one or the other. There's a continuum of policy responses, but this has throughout been an effort to try to negotiate a end to the crisis, but at the same time to ratchet up the pressure on Russia to incentivize it to negotiate. So I don't think it's something that's been done without any thinking or pattern before that. Also, in terms of the objectives of the sanctions, I think, as has been said, there are a variety of objectives, but it is to try to cut out the economic means for Russia to be prosecuting the war. And as I said, in hindsight, if Ukraine is completely devastated, people may say, did we have too many loopholes in the sanctions? Not were the sanctions too severe? I do think the suggestion that was made is an excellent one, is that when you have this type of behavior, you should look at trying to compensate and provide some assistance to countries that have collateral damage as a outcome of the sanctions. That's a perfectly appropriate behavior. But in terms of the rules that were broken here were the basic principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty, of peaceful resolution of dispute, of following international law, of the laws of warfare where you don't go indiscriminately after civilian targets. I mean, that's the problem that people are responding to. The sanctions didn't somehow appear out of the blue and have created the problems. So I think that's a response to several of the questions here.
Manuel, the tantalizing possibility that was raised of Trump-Le Pen combo, would they have acted differently?
Can I just, there's a misperception, and I'm not here to defend President Trump, but the U.S. policy actually, despite his own effort to have a good personal relationship with Putin, had very severe sanctions on Russia during the last term. In fact, he had completely stopped Nord Stream 2, which was then resurrected with the Biden administration, has now been subsequently stopped. So there's this misperception to a certain degree that the the United States had a very permissive attitude toward Russia. It's just not true.
I'll answer 2.5 questions, since the other half about President Trump was answered. On the goals of sanctions, as I said, you've got 3. Deterrence is not strictly speaking a goal for sanctions. You've got signaling, which may have a deterrence dimension. You've got constraining. You make it more difficult to access some particular goods, equipment, for instance. And you have coercing, which is trying to make more difficult the functioning of the system that attack Ukraine, for instance. And so I very much agree with everything Alena just said, except for the one bit where she agreed with Heribert on the Crimea sanctions that were not effective from 2014. Actually, in 2014, you had a rally around the flag effect around Putin, which had nothing to do with sanctions because it happened when the Crimea annexation happened. And since then, that popularity from Putin has plummeted. It's plummeted enough that there was enough discontent in Russia that he had to turn to more repression. And now there is even more repression precisely because there is the fear that this rally around the flag that posters from Russia claim is happening is not that strong, is not that sustainable, and is not working. But the effect is not that. The effect of the 2014 sanctions have to do with what I mentioned, the war machine. If you look at military spending, Russian military spending in 2014, there was before that a huge boost of Russian military spending and a huge effort of military modernization that has not happened at that same pace since 2014, since the sanctions on Crimea. And that modernization has stalled and corruption has prevailed. And maybe what we've seen in terms of the ineffectiveness of the Russian army actually has something to do with these 2014 sanctions. Clearly, if you're looking at what happens in Crimea, it's not very satisfying, but there is an impact. The other point I wanted to answer is actually also your question on what Sarah was asking about, is there a responsibility? Of course there is a responsibility. As I said, sanctions don't target food trade. That's the first expression of this solidarity and responsibility, but that's not enough. So you have those who block Ukraine wheat exports, that's Russia. You have those who blame the sanctions for the food security crisis, which had started actually before sanctions and may have to do a lot more with the war than with sanctions. That would be China. And then you have those trying to address this issue. And for instance, the French president has taken this initiative. It's called FARM, Food and Agricultural Resilience Mission. And the idea is not only to have an international effort in terms of solidarity, of humanitarian emergency assistance, through, for instance, the World Food Programme, but it's also ensure transparency of market and resilience of trade. The fact that stocks that are happening are disclosed and that there is pressure on those stocks to respond to the immediate needs. And also, third level of this initiative, the idea to promote more sustainable local production of food, production capacity in the countries that we know, because we know these countries who have this kind of structural risk of food insecurity. So yes, there is. And the half question on Le Pen, there was a debate in between the two terms between Le Pen and Macron. And that's the one point on which she agreed, the candidate Le Pen agreed with the president, with what he had done on Ukraine. She agreed during the debate with his policy, and she even more or less said that it was a good policy and that she supported it. She voted differently before that, but in a way she had to shift position because of the way the French public sees this and the way the debate has unfolded. So what she would do if she were in power is something else. That's not my job, but you can notice that she had to change position.
So, yeah, as you can see, we diplomats are really boring. We'll see the predictable things. But last words to you.
Yeah, I would like to come back to the question of the Germans not realizing that they live in a world where security has to be provided by someone. That is a significant point, and I share it completely. Germany was for a long period of time living under the illusion that you don't need military, and we were very happy to spend money on other things. What irritates me is that we are now full swing going in the other direction. And that is something surprising. I would also like to point out at the end that when we talk about the sanctions, we should ask ourselves, why is a country like India so reluctant? What does that mean for the understanding of the international order? Does India identify double standards in the international order that should be addressed? And I could name a few people who have been writing exactly on that question. But the sheer number is impressive, but it also is reflecting that 140 countries are not participating, and they must have a reason for not participating. And those 140 countries and their governments are outraged about the invasion of Ukraine, but they are not delighted by the sanctions response. And I think we should continue to look at this reluctance. Why is it there, and why is a country like India happily sitting on the fence and not moving?
It's called a principled position, but I'll leave it at that. Alena, last word, please. And I know
very briefly, just going quite quickly to Crimea and about the alternative systems. Actually, after Crimea, because of the sanctions, Russia invested a lot in creating systems that can a little bit be disconnected from the West. They invested a lot in creating the internet that be cut off, into financial systems, crypto, whatnot. And guess what? Actually, it's not working even now. So it shows that actually it's not that easy to create alternative systems, especially at the global level. Of course, it's in nobody's interest to have this bifurcation, but it's not going to happen over time, and any alternative system will need to still build trust. On the threshold of when the sanctions can be stopped or when it can be decided that they're effective or not, my guess is that if there's some kind of a peace settlement that Ukraine can live with or can work with, most of the draconian sanctions will be reverted and will be removed. Some sanctions will stay, but they're for different purposes. Like, for example, some restrictions on trade in high tech. But again, this is, most countries wouldn't even call it sanctions, but some kind of limitations of how far we can want to do business with Russia. And very quickly, the EU is waking up to the need that it does bear responsibility not only for the collateral damage of the sanctions, but that it does have to pay more attention to what's happening in the world. There are several initiatives that are being announced. Von der Leyen was there with some tech council, trade council, and so on. French is doing a lot actually in the region, but even in other parts of Europe that were not that much concerned with the rest of the world before, there is this awakening that we do share responsibility, especially if we want the rest of the world to support us right now when we need their help.
Thank you very much. Round of applause for our wonderful panelists and their very candid comments and some great questions from the audience. Thank you very much. Good night, and see you bright and early tomorrow morning.